Today's lecture focuses on the evolution of games, particularly with personal development. Video games in themselves are very good mediums for transferring information, be this information for entertainment purposes or for even training purposes in the real world, as we'll later explore. So our essential question is, how do games impact our personal development? How do games influence individuals? To explain this, let's begin with early play. Early play is the childhood learning. It's our adaptation to our environment, to different things that we react to. In the case of our early play, we use tactics of play to focus on developing primitive survival skills. This includes our hand-eye coordination. This also includes our muscle memory, our brain extremity pathways, which are used frequently to enhance nerve firing to movement response times. What this does is it allows us to react quicker based on whatever it is that we're trying to do. Say we're trying to catch a ball falling off of the table. We can react quickly as opposed to slowly if we do activities like this during our play. This also increases our motor skills and our social skills. Social skills because we continue to play with others, especially in our childhood years. So the next part allows us to go into our physical competition. Now, play is not one of the things where it's just limited to video games. Play is something that can be limited to just about everything in the world. We can consider work as play in some cases, depending on what it is that we're trying to accomplish. It really just depends on our point of view. But as far as a physical competition, we can usually see the Olympic Games as our physical competition. We can also see other competitive sports. But this allows us to develop our formal structure to a game. Our formal structure consists of three things: rules, an environment, and victory conditions. You have to have some kind of way to win. So for the Olympic Games, for the 100-meter dash, the rules are competitors must remain in their respective lanes. They can't cross lanes, otherwise they may be able to push somebody over. And competitors must also be free of illegal substances. Illegal substances, in some cases, may be able to benefit the player. It also may be a detriment to the player. Either way, they have to be what we call clean in terms of running the race. The environment, for a 100-meter dash, our environment takes place on a track. It has to. For the victory condition, in the Olympic Games, the first three times to pass the finish line, the top three times, receive gold, silver, and bronze medals respectively, based on what it is that their time came in. So we have physical competition, but games can also challenge us mentally, and this stimulates our intellectual competition. And intellectual competition is the development of mental acuity via thought-provoking activities. Thought-provoking games could include puzzles, could include board games, could include card games. Notice I didn't include video games here. Video games are part of our intellectual competition. It's a very large part. However, describing our very basic foundations, our childhood play, typically we see games and activities other than video games. So our mental stimulation spurs our game immersion, and this really just absorbs us into what it is we're doing. This absorbs us into the activity that we choose to play. So breaking down our puzzles and board games, our puzzles are mental competition that can be completed through trial and error. Think, for example, of a large two-dimensional puzzle that you're trying to piece together. When you're going through all of the pieces, you're looking at pieces and you're saying, hey, this one looks okay. It might fit in this spot. So you try it. That is trial and error, because most likely there's a lot of pieces that look very similar. However, they do not all fit in the same exact spots. Hence, you have to try it, and then if it doesn't work, you save it for later. Puzzles are also typically single player. Now they can be multiplayer depending on the scale of the puzzle, and it also depends on the people or persons involved in creating and finishing the puzzle. We typically do not theme puzzles. However, you may notice that puzzles have like a picture, or that there's like, especially for 3D puzzles, there's different sections, there's different types out there. These are not considered themed. To be themed, we'll actually discuss this later. But to be themed is to basically have a single mode of thought that will surround the environment as well as the player while you're actually in play. After you complete a puzzle, typically some people glue them, some people break them up and throw them back into a box. However, there's usually no replay value. And the reason for this is because the challenge has already been accomplished. The challenge is very much reduced after you already complete the initial puzzle. As far as board games are a mental competition that definitely requires strategy. Think of Monopoly, for example. Monopoly requires a lot of strategy, and that strategy typically changes throughout the game. So it also requires a little bit of chance in your board game, because if you start to do poorly in Monopoly, you change your strategy to adjust to your current standing. Whereas if you're doing very well, you change your strategy to keep yourself going well. Typically, board games require two or more players. Some games can go all the way up to 8 players. Just depends who you're playing with, what you're doing. But often, there is a theme to the game. So, for example, Monopoly, still continuing with this example, the theme of Monopoly is to dominate all of the real estate. And the mentality that you have is you're going in and you're trying to basically be Donald Trump, working on accomplishing your goals of capturing all of the real estate properties on the board. There is a high replay value due to variable strategies. As we discussed before, if you're doing very well or if you're doing poorly, your strategy changes. This can change per game. So just because you complete one game and you did really well doesn't mean that you're going to do really well in the next game. This is part of the chance that we also discussed as well, because the chance will kind of throw in a variable that you can't always determine, whereas a puzzle, you don't have chance. Now, card games also have a little bit of chance. They also have a little bit of strategy. It really depends on what the card game is. However, we generally say that card games do have chance and strategy, and it usually requires one or more players. A one-player card game would be something like Solitaire, and there's a lot of chance and there's a lot of strategy there. More chance than strategy, however, based on what cards you actually have in your hand. And on top of that, if you look at other games such as poker, for example, most of the game is chance. It's based on what cards you actually receive. However, if you look at poker players, they use a strategy of, if they have a bad hand, they may bluff it. Or they may actually say instead that they're going to go through and just fold their cards. They don't want to lose money. And their strategy changes based on how the game is being played. So it's not necessarily the card game but that changes the strategy. It's more or less how the game is played that changes the strategy here. Card games are not typically themed. There is really no mentality on the actual card game, just like a puzzle, whereas board games do have a mentality. And there is a high replay value due to the high variability. Whenever you get a deck of 52 cards, your chances of getting the same hand each time you play are extremely slim to none. Most likely your game will change as you keep playing. So our game immersion is something that we need to also recognize. This applies to any kind of activity, but especially games, and especially modern video games. So game immersion is the act or experience of pretending to be in the game world. It's extremely important for anyone who's developing games. Reason for this is your player immersion determines usually how many sales you actually get in your game. For example, if you produced Psychonauts, one of the leading games for the original Xbox before its release, if you produce Psychonauts, after Microsoft dropped the game from the console, they actually lost a lot of sales, even though the game had a lot of immersion. However, the game that followed up Psychonauts, Halo, from Microsoft Studios, Halo had extreme immersion, extreme game immersion, which really enticed players to buy that game. As they bought the game, obviously sales went up, and we got many sequels from that point onwards. Now, game immersion is not always a good thing. Even though, yes, you are drawing in your players, you're able to draw in different elements of their real life, or even just completely drop their real life and make them into this space superhero or an alien hunter of some sort, or anything of that nature. There are side effects to player immersion. So some of the player immersion side effects include desensitization to violence. If they're alien hunters, if they're running through, say, Halo, and they're trying to blow up different items, they're trying to achieve different goals, they're running through a lot of battle scenes. What this typically does is obviously cause violence within the video game. However, if players see violence too much, and often at a very young age, this usually desensitizes people to the actual violence, and this could also affect real-world situations. Hence, some players actually also lose touch with reality, bringing up the next point here. And sometimes game immersion will even lead into marriage, depending on the immersion level and who you're playing with. Now, this is also part of the social development. These two players were actually Microsoft Xbox fans. They played Halo together. They actually met online, and then they decided, since they both were connected through Halo, that they would get married with Master Chief and two of the Marine Guards, which are flanking them on either side. And it's actually quite interesting. However, game immersion it has many different side effects, and you never really know what all of these side effects may actually be. So, behavioral development. In video games, our behavioral development can impact how our players react to different situations, just like in the real world. In most games, we have some kind of meter of good. The basic idea of the meter of good is if you have good behavior, you're getting rewarded. If you have bad behavior, you get punished, depending on what the actual punishment is. Now, something to note here is that in some games, they will have two different storylines. They will have something like a light side, not pulling too much from Star Wars here, but if you look at Knights of the Old Republic or KOTOR, the light side allowed you to get certain powers, whereas if you went to the dark side, you got certain powers. However, if you stayed right in the middle, you really couldn't get as much as if you went to either side. So sometimes games actually force you to align yourself to either good or bad behavior within the game. If there is a stimulant, let's say, for good behavior, players may tend to go good behavior. However, the same is true for dark side. If there is a stimulant for bad behavior, players will go towards bad behavior. What this actually is coming from is Pavlov's dog experiment. And Pavlov, let me just explain really quick. Pavlov had a very brief experiment with a dog, and he trained a dog to salivate whenever the dog was about to receive a treat. Pavlov rang a bell, and the dog would automatically know that something was coming to him. This good behavior, if you will, allowed the dog to mentally recognize every single time the bell was rang that he was going to receive a treat. The same is also true with our video games. We as developers are now Pavlov, and in our video games we're ringing a bell, such as a stimulant, such as if you do this activity you get this wonderful weapon of Oz, or you get some kind of reward such as money or whatnot within the game. Now, what happens is we're stimulated to do those activities that we're provided a reward for. If we're punished, sometimes there is a detriment that we may receive, but also there may be a stimulant behind that punishment as well. It really just depends on you, the developer, and how you're trying to involve your player into the game. What this does is sometimes players that learn this differentiation between good and bad sometimes get a very confused view of the real world. They may lose touch with reality because there isn't always a true good or a true bad in reality. There's usually a lot of gray. Life decisions usually have, game decisions usually have a very substantial impact, which have a save and play later. So you could save your game before you actually act on something and then go back and say, oh, that didn't work out well, or oh, that worked really well, so do it again. In life, in real life, you don't always have that option, so there's usually no save and play later actions that you can actually say, oh, that didn't quite work out well, I don't think I'll do that again. Or go back and do that, redo that. Another part of our behavioral development is actually the social aspect. Now, social development for video games, if you're looking at the social development of play in general, usually we play with others. Usually, as childhood learning experiences go, we usually have a group of individuals that usually play with each other. They could be playing knights and dragons or anything of that nature. However, in a video game, usually what happens, especially with modern video games, usually what happens is we have an artificial intelligence. Our friend is the video game, and this could be a huge detriment. However, there's also beneficial aspects to video game play, because what happens is, say we have online play. If we're playing with friends over the internet, or if we're playing with friends on the same console within our house, that could be online play or it could be console play. Either way, you're involving others, and you're able to stimulate your social aspect by communicating via the game to the other individuals. Now, usually what happens, from my personal experiences, whenever I'm playing a game with somebody else, I recognize that I'm talking to them about things that may have happened at work or things that may have happened back in college, at school. It's very different, and it's based on who you play with. But as I said, there is a huge detriment that if some players actually get absorbed into the game, they may cocoon, as we call it in the industry, and they will lose touch with other individuals, so they may lack that person-to-person interaction. Which brings us kind of into our cognitive development. And cognitive development is basically the development of intelligence via learning, remembering, and innovating. Video games have a high mental demand. What they do is they stimulate players via learning. Usually you get some kind of tutorial in the very beginning. You also get remembering, so this is a little bit lower mental demand within the actual game, but sometimes you have some issues where you have to remember a sequence of dialogue that you had earlier in the game, or you're reminded of that, and then you have to use that information to innovate. So you have to use that information to actually go through and create something new or display some kind of actions within the game. So video games have both the high and low mental demands. High mental demand usually offers substantial decision making and other skills such as logic, and what this can do is the player can take the skills that they learn as far as critical thinking and decision making, logical thinking. They can take all of those things and actually apply it to their real world applications, be it at work, be it at school, be it anywhere. However, it does not always have to be for entertainment. Now, it can be displayed through entertainment, hence the video game, but it does not have to be for entertainment. So, for example, if they worked at a law firm, they could very easily take their critical thinking skills that they learned in a game and actually apply it to what they do at work. Not necessarily for talking about games, but for talking about whatever it is they have to. Now, you also get low mental demand that can be used in real life decisions. Typically, you don't have something very beneficial to the player whenever it comes to the low mental demand. However, it is entertaining, but they may be able to use this information for something that they can apply in the real world to what they actually do, even if it happens to be to stir conversation up, which is a little bit more of a low mental demand as opposed to, say, the working in a law firm. And also with our cognitive development, what we notice a lot in society is people usually stereotype. And from the video game industry aspect, we're looking at the stereotyping as good and evil. Now, our friend or foe, good or evil, it doesn't matter how you call it, typically the good guy is dressed in white. This was actually started way back in like the 50s and even before that, where old westerns had the good guy dressed in white and he had a white hat. The bad guy was always dressed in black and had a black hat. So our friend and foe characteristics are usually a little bit confused as far as who's actually good, who's actually bad. Is there a true good? Is there a true bad? Or are our ideas just completely reversed? And a great example is actually from it's from one of the old westerns, and I have an image over here on the right side that says, "Which is a friend?" And on top you have one cowboy with a white hat, a little bit of a brown vest, and then on the bottom you have a cowboy with a black hat and a black shirt. So you're looking at these images and you're kind of wondering, alright, who's actually the friend and who's the foe? But in truth, neither is actually a foe. Both of these cowboys are actually good guys. They're actually brothers in the show that this is taken from. And if you're looking at this image, you may say, oh, okay, the guy on top with the white hat has a bit of a really mean face right now, whereas the guy on the bottom kind of has that good look to him where it's like, okay, yeah, he's probably questioning something. And you may also say, oh, this is probably a trick question because we just went over who's good, who's bad. But in truth, they're actually both good. So keep that in mind whenever you're developing games. You don't actually have to have a good guy dressed in white. You don't have to have a bad guy dressed in black. And sometimes, for a nice plot twist, you may actually want to dress the good guy in black and the bad guy in white. And the reason you do this is you kind of just twist it on the player to change their views as far as what's happening in the game and what's happening within your plot. Now, playing video games also helps to develop our motor skills as individuals. And the way we see this is, our motor skills are learning to control muscles to perform specific tasks. Well, in video games, players have to use a controller. So the benefits to the player is you're increasing their muscle responsiveness. As they keep playing, they're going to get faster at what they do. And as you use real-world applications, especially in the modern world, modern society, a lot of applications can be done on a controller or a keyboard or something of that nature, whereas back in the past, this may not have applied. However, you do also have a detriment, as you do have a benefit, but you also have a detriment whenever you are working on developing motor skills. If your players are playing too much, they can actually injure themselves due to just excessive play, and they may also lack physical activity, which will also cause other health issues later down the line. So playing video games is a good thing, but we don't want to keep our players on the couch all day long, 24/7 playing a video game, because this is just basically putting somebody out there and wasting them away because they're sitting on a couch playing our game. And we want them to actually go out and work, because think of it this way as well, who's going to buy your sequel? So you need to know who is actually out there who likes your game, and you want them to really like your game, but you don't want them to like it so much that they lose touch with reality, they injure themselves, and they also get other health issues just from playing too much. Which brings us to the last point. And the last point here is, can we play to train? So in the real world, based off Pavlov's experiment, we said that Pavlov used a bell to ring to let the dog know that a treat was coming, and the dog automatically responded to something. In video game play, can we do the same thing? And the answer to this is very controversial, but think of maybe flight simulations, for example, or military simulations. These are technically video games. They may not have a victory condition per se, other than staying safe and arriving safely or completing a mission safely. And they definitely have an environment, and the rules of the simulation may not be limited to just simple programming. It may be real-world rules. So can we play to train? And if we're saying yes to this, it allows our players to gain training in a very safe environment. However, they're learning about things that may be encountered in the real world. I'm going back to a flight simulation. Pilots are usually trained for thousands of hours in a flight simulator before they ever step foot in an actual commercial cockpit for flight. And typically, a junior pilot in a commercial airliner will have very little actual flight time versus simulation time. And this is sometimes a good thing, sometimes a bad thing. It really just depends. But it allows the pilot to learn about his environment before he actually ever steps foot in the environment. And he knows how to react to different situations. For example, if an engine went out, or if the vertical stabilizer went out, or any kind of situation, or flying through bad weather, etc., etc. You get the idea. So it allows our player or our trainee to increase their responsiveness to different situations. So we can technically use video games to play, to train as well as to play, but video games don't only have to be for entertainment purposes, which is the main point here. So as a discussion, should video games be used for personal development to prepare individuals for the real world? We kind of answered this on the last slide, but I really want your opinion. Should we be able to use video games and simulations, which are an extension of video games, to train individuals? Should we be able to use these items to gather information that would happen or may happen in the real world to let individuals know before they actually experience those situations? That way they can increase their responsiveness. Please feel free to answer that on the online discussion forums. And as far as today's lecture, please make sure you rank yourself. 0, you shouldn't have a 0. If you have a 0, please rewatch the video. All the way to 5. And if you're at 5, excellent. If you're anywhere below 5, I would suggest rewatching this or bringing up some questions in the next class. And also make sure to take your Cornell notes on this lecture.